Okay, so what's really interesting about what we just spent all that time talking about in England is that it did not remain fixed. Many of those characteristics changed in dramatic ways. Today we're going to talk about two really big changes that happened to agriculture, which were enclosure and the agricultural revolution. Enclosure entails a change in property rights, and changes in farming methods are what we will call the agricultural revolution. These major changes happened roughly between about 1600 and 1800. And a really fascinating question is whether these two are related, and did one cause the other, or maybe there's something else that pushes both. You may have heard in your high school European history class a pretty simple old story, which is that enclosure caused farming methods to improve and magic caused the Industrial Revolution. We're going to introduce quite a bit more nuance into that story, which I think makes it more interesting. Let's talk first about enclosure. From roughly the medieval period, 1500, 1600, up to 1800, something happens to the structure of English farms. They consolidated, and they consolidated in a few ways. So, in other words, consolidated means they agglomerated together and they got bigger. So one way, for the older way, is that large nobles started to buy out smaller owner-occupiers, yeomen, and by that way, their farms started to consolidate and get larger. But there's another way, which is called enclosure. Enclosure is what it sounds like. It is the fencing in of land for individual farmers. That is very different from the open field structure that we discussed in the last video, where the village just has these giant fields, open and unfenced, animals graze in common pasture, and farmers are sort of walking around freely. This simple act of enclosing, fencing in land, has huge consequences for property rights and organization. So the first is a major change in usage rights. If the land becomes fenced for individuals, the common rights, particularly over pasture, are gone, right? Those are now individual rights. Furthermore, owners will have exclusive deeds or titles to that newly enclosed, formerly common land. Furthermore, if individuals now own their own farms which are enclosed, that obviates the need for that village coordination across that one giant arable piece of land. Now, it is not true that enclosure immediately gave a whole different kind of property right to the arable land. However, at the same time, there was a conversion of a lot of the copyhold tenure to more formal leasehold tenure, more formal pieces of paper. That is a slightly more secure property right, and that you don't have to rely on like the whim and trust of the manor, but it often meant that the tenant would have to pay more rent. It was often more expensive. Now, if you like, a simple story of this, right, is that enclosure equals better property rights, period. And so I'm just trying to give you guys a more nuanced and true picture of how this actually worked. Critically, enclosure happened in two phases and happened in two really different ways. So before the 18th century, before the 1700s, enclosure was done through a process of what's called voluntary enclosure. Now, this is voluntary for the landlord, right? The landlord could just decide, I don't like my village this way, I'm just going to enclose it now, right? And then everything is fenced, right? Or a village could decide, they could have a unanimous vote to enclose all or some of the village's land. Remember, if the village is fully enclosed, usually what this means is a loss of some of the common rights over, for example, pasturing. But later on, Parliament gets involved. Parliament decides that enclosure is good. It seems to be good for productivity, they think. And so what happens is the majority of villages are starting to be able to petition Parliament, and they get an individual law. They get an act of Parliament that will then enclose that village. And usually, at least what that would entail, is that the leaseholders would be compensated somehow for their loss of their commons access. So these are the two processes of enclosure. Enclosure was the hotly debated change of the day. And that's because, like any economic change, like any change of this sort, there were winners and there were losers. The richer farmers here are the clear winners. They got to consolidate and usually add to their land holdings. The poorer farmers lost their rights to the commons. For a poor farmer that maybe had very little land in strips, but some animals, those common pasture rights were critical to survival. When those poor farmers lost their rights to the commons, they often had no choice but to sell out to those rich farmers who could then consolidate, and they left agriculture. That, may have actually by itself boosted agricultural productivity because some of the least productive farmers left. This also, by the way, was kind of a big deal for Marx, and actually maybe without knowing it, you may be already familiar with the Marxist story. Marx said that this caused a process of release. He called it labor release from agriculture, and then those workers moved to cities, perhaps fueling industrialization. We'll come back to that point. That's a rather big debate still. However, you can see evidence that indeed there was decreased employment in agriculture, either because of enclosure or something else. So this is a really cool map from the Atlas of Industrializing Britain. And if you look closely at this map, you can see how many people are leaving agriculture between these two periods of 1851 and 1911. There's a big exit from agriculture that continues well into the 20th century. Now, simultaneously, there are other really interesting things happening in English farms. There's a technological revolution, a dramatic increase in productivity that we call the agricultural revolution. There were a few there's a lot going on, but I want to talk about a few really critical innovations. The first one is called convertible husbandry, which is just a fancy way of saying that strict division between arable and pasture is broken. The animals are allowed onto the arable fields. This is a really critical notion, really critical part of the agricultural revolution. What's interesting about letting animals onto the arable fields? Well, animals, have inputs and outputs, and the outputs are good fertilizer. And so that's it sounds like an obvious thing to do, but it was a big leap forward in productivity. And we'll talk about some other ways that this worked with other innovations as well. Also, there were just lots of subtle changes happening over time. New varieties of seeds, for example. Farmers, of course, have been selectively breeding animals, since the beginning of time. This is not a new notion, but there were some leaps forward in productive animal breeds at this time that would have, for example, more meat or would produce more dairy given the amount of feed they were given. Also, butchering has some important leaps forward. I posted for you on the course site a Bon Appetit video that I just love, which is this real expert guy taking a cow apart. And I did this because I want to show you that there's a lot of choices you make in butchering, and figuring out how to get more meat and less waste off of an animal is a kind of specialized knowledge that has evolved over time. There were also the introduction of some really important tools, one of the most important of which is called the seed drill. And what that does is it literally is just a drill. It drills into the ground, and then when you drop seeds in, they're more likely to propagate. Okay, it sounds really simple, but it made a really big difference in yields and how much output you would get given the seeds. One of the most famous innovations in this period is the introduction of plants that help the fundamental process of rotation. So in particular, nitrogen fixing plants like legumes, clover. These are special plants that tend to actually put nitrogen back into the soil. So if you introduce those along with rotation, you're going to get less waste. And also, this sounds really prosaic and boring, but turnips were an important innovation. Why? Turnips, you can feed them to animals and they're really nutritious, but also turnips have this property where they keep weeds down. You don't have as many weeds to worry about in the fallow if you're planting turnips. All of this together, right, enclosure and these agricultural changes simultaneously are creating, we think, or occurring along with a change in social structure, where now we have at the top some very rich landlords and then some very substantial tenants. The little guys, the yeomen, are disappearing, and then there's a large class of landless laborers displaced by all of this. Those landless laborers can also work on farms. A lot of this stuff comes together in a really famous invention, which is called Norfolk four-course rotation. So not a three-field system now, but a four-field system. Just like the three-field system, when you introduce another kind of division, and especially in this special way, you can get further increases in productivity. So what Norfolk four-course rotation does is it takes convertible husbandry and nitrogen fixing and the turnips, and it brings them together to create an entire incredibly productive rotation system. The way this works is you've got 4 fields. You have wheat in one, and then turnips, and then barley, and then clover. Okay, so you've got turnips, which diminish the weeds and also provide fodder for the animals, and then clover, which is fixing nitrogen. What you do is then you also let the animals onto the clover field. The animals graze on that clover. Remember, what goes in must come out. That produces fertilizer that can be used on that field or elsewhere. Furthermore, the turnips, again, they keep the weeds down, but also you can harvest them, and that creates more food for the animals, which means even more fertilizer. So there's less waste. There is no field in this system that is true fallow. Nothing is simply left to rest. Every field is working. And also, there's no true pasture, right? All of it is together in this one system. So here's like an incomprehensible diagram of this, but it kind of conveys to you that there's a really complex system of inputs and outputs going on here, right? We've got animals that are eating the grass and clover, and then they're producing manure, which is like going everywhere, and then every year again, the whole system will rotate. And this could be happening within any of the open field that still existed, or within the fields of a farmer's enclosed land. This is a major leap forward in productivity. Okay, that was a lot. If you want to encompass all of these changes all together and really try to understand where increases in output per worker that we observe are coming from, you can decompose this. This is, I think, some really nice economics. And this breakdown appears in your reading in Allen chapter 3. So we can decompose output per labor as output over improved area times improved area versus total area times total area per unit labor. And so there are changes happening in each of these 3 terms, right? We've described a lot of the output per improved area, these improvements in seeds, animals, rotation, etc. It's also worth noting, however, that there was a change in improved area over total area. There was a massive draining project in England called the draining of the fens. The fens were a kind of wet, swampy part of England, and also a lot of conversion of wasteland to pasture land. And then finally, remember that a lot of farmers are exiting. Okay, there is a decrease in employment in agriculture, which is going to drive up total area per unit labor. All of this together means that there was a lot of change in the amount of food being produced in England in this period, in the amount of output per person.